Hey there, friend. You're just in time. Tonight's story may not be suitable for children church ladies or anyone who thinks medieval life was all candlelight and poetry, because we're about to take a quiet, slightly scandalous stroll through the romantic lives of your ancestors. And trust me, they had no privacy, no deodorant, and very little idea of what they were doing. So before you settle in, go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe put on a fan or open a window for that soft nighttime breeze. And if you like my video, comment number 1. If you don't like my video, well, go ahead and hit the like button anyway. I won't tell. Now, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? What time is it? Where you are? Are you curled up in bed with someone special or flying solo tonight? I read every comment, even the ones posted at 3 a.m. by insomniacs in Nebraska. Right. Now that we're comfortable, let me tell you something. The romantic life of medieval people wasn't soft focus and slow motion. It was mostly awkward, itchy, and governed by the church calendar. You didn't get to be in the mood, you had to schedule it, and then hope it didn't fall on the feast of St. Benedict. Tonight we'll walk through 12 strange truths about sex and love in the Middle Ages. From forbidden days to faulty birth control, from gossiping neighbors to papal micromanagement, you'll see that the greatest miracle of all might be that anyone managed to fall in love at all. So breathe deep, let go of your day, and come with me into a world where the chamber pot was under the bed, the family goat was probably watching, and romance had to survive on pure stubbornness. You wake up to the soft clucking of a chicken that isn't yours, the low grunt of a pig near your feet, and the faint sound of your father-in-law snoring from the other side of the room. No, you're not dreaming. This is your home. One room, no walls, no privacy, and absolutely no place for romance. If you wanted affection in the Middle Ages, you needed strategy. You shared everything, bed space, air with your entire family, and often your livestock. Nights were cold blankets, were thin and bodies piled together like mismatched spoons just to stay warm. And in that pile, you were expected to fall in love. Or at least, try. Some couples, bless them, got creative. They waited until everyone was snoring or drunk. They whispered under scratchy wool blankets, trying not to laugh when the family dog decided it was his turn to climb into bed. Others gave up entirely and found quiet moments behind the hay cart or in the corner of the barn. Not ideal, but at least the goat couldn't gossip. Even among nobles who had actual beds, privacy was a myth. Servants were often asleep in the same room or standing nearby in case their lord needed a snack, a towel, or someone to admire his hair. A passionate embrace had to be squeezed in between wardrobe changes, prayer sessions, and the third course of dinner. And if you thought traveling would help, think again. Inns often had communal beds. That's right. Strangers. In one mattress. You, your spouse, and a man from 3 villages over who snores like a dying warhorse. Try whispering sweet nothings with him kicking your shin. But even that wasn't the real challenge. The real problem was timing. Medieval Europe wasn't just nosy, it was scheduled. The church had thoughts about when intimacy was allowed, and any time you're both awake and in the mood was not one of them. Certain days were sacred. Others were forbidden. There were rules. So even if your family was asleep, the goat was distracted, and the guy in the corner wasn't watching it, might still be the wrong day. And if you broke the rules, you didn't just risk your soul, you risked the shame of public confession, a fine, or worse, being the subject of the miller's wife's gossip for the next 3 months. Still, love found a way. Clumsy, inconvenient, but determined. And speaking of rules, wait until you see just how many days were actually off limits. So let's say you've managed the impossible. Everyone's asleep. The dog is on the floor. The goat is miraculously facing the other direction. Your partner gives you that look. You know the one, and for a brief moment, everything aligns. Except, you've forgotten what day it is, because in medieval Europe, not all days were created equal. The church had opinions, and by opinions I mean an aggressively detailed list of when intimacy was off limits. And they weren't just suggestions, they were moral landmines. Start with the obvious Sundays. Day of the Lord. No touching. Then Fridays, a day of penance. Nope. Wednesdays, suspicious. The church wasn't sure what was wrong with Wednesdays, but better safe than sorry. Add in the entire season of Lent 40 days straight of absolutely not. Advent also no. That's another month. Then stack on major feast days, minor feast days, saints' days, fast days, and oh yes, full moons in some places. It was less a calendar and more a divine obstacle course. Some regions took things further. A 13th century bishop in Normandy once declared that married couples should abstain on over 180 days of the year. Half the calendar. Half, and if you were especially devout, you were encouraged to bump those numbers even higher. And let's be clear, this wasn't about sin in the big, flashy sense. This was about regulation. The soul had to stay focused on heaven, and nothing derailed your moral compass quite like affection and, heaven forbid, enthusiasm. So what happened if you broke the rules? You could be fined, summoned to confess publicly, or suffer that most medieval of punishments, everyone in town knowing your business. Imagine getting side-eyed at the village well because you got frisky during the feast of St. Agatha. And yet, people tried to keep up. Some families kept charts. Others relied on the local priest to remind them, though I suspect a few conveniently forgot to ask. For the wealthy spiritual advisors might schedule your romantic life like a court appearance. For peasants, you were just trying to survive the winter and not die of boredom. The rules still applied, but enforcement was flexible. Still, all of this shows one thing: the church didn't just shape belief, it shaped bedrooms. And in some cases, it shaped what didn't happen in them. But if you think the church only cared about when, wait until you hear what they thought about how. Now, even if you managed to pick the right day, miraculously dodging saints' fasts and lunar cycles, you still had another hurdle: how you were supposed to do it. Because in the medieval world, physical intimacy wasn't about passion. It wasn't about pleasure. It wasn't even about bonding. It was about one thing: procreation. Anything else was either unnecessary, sinful, or both. The church had a very specific script in mind. Intimacy should be brief, emotionless, and preferably guilt-ridden. You weren't supposed to look forward to it. You certainly weren't supposed to enjoy it. In fact, a truly pious couple would engage without smiling delay or even eye contact, because nothing ruins holiness like enthusiasm. The approved method missionary. Always. Not for variety, not for comfort, but because it mimicked nature, required minimal creativity, and left no room for pleasure. Anything outside of that kissing, too much touching, too long experimenting with, well, anything, was frowned upon or outright condemned. Heaven, as it turned out, had very specific choreography. And don't think for a second that marriage gave you a free pass. Oh no. In fact, married couples were often held to even stricter standards. You had to act with restraint. You had to be modest. And if you found yourself actually enjoying your spouse, well, maybe it was time to go to confession. There were manuals, actual written guides for confessors. Some included checklists of acceptable and unacceptable behaviors. Others listed questions so explicit you wonder if the priests were asking or researching. And many of these texts encouraged confessors to probe pun fully intended for signs of unholy passion, even within marriage. A particularly cheery 13th century guide suggested couples should come together without pleasure, without sin, and without delay. Which sounds less like romance and more like a tax deadline. Of course, not everyone followed the rules, especially among peasants who were too tired to memorize theological nuance and too poor to afford guilt. For them, the rules were mostly theoretical best, nodded at politely, and then promptly ignored. Still, the church's attitude left a lasting mark. Even in private, even among the devout, joy was always suspect. And sometimes joy had to be confessed away. But what if the priest didn't just suspect joy? What if he knew? Let's talk about confession. So you slipped. You smiled. Maybe you even whispered something sweet. Maybe you felt close to your spouse, truly close. And now it's morning. The pig is snoring. The room smells faintly of straw and cooked onions. But there's something heavier in the air, guilt. Because in your world, pleasure is dangerous and joy must be accounted for. Time to confess. Confession in the Middle Ages wasn't the soft spiritual cleansing you might imagine. It wasn't about forgiveness so much as surveillance. The priest didn't just want to know if you had sinned. He wanted to know how. In detail. The kind of detail that makes you consider joining a silent order just to avoid the conversation. Confessors were trained to be thorough, and I do mean thorough. Manuals were written, actual handbooks with pages of questions designed to sniff out every stray impulse and flicker of enjoyment. This wasn't, did you sin? It was, where exactly was your hand, and for how long? I wish I were joking. Picture it. You're kneeling face to face with a man who's known you since childhood. He once blessed your cow. Now he's asking whether you delayed the act for more enjoyment, whether you used certain words, whether you felt too much affection, whether you, heaven forbid, smiled. Yes, smiling could be a red flag. Smiling suggested you liked it. And if you liked, maybe you weren't suffering enough. Some confessors took things further. They didn't just wait for you to admit your sins, they led you to them. They asked leading questions. They used examples. One particularly curious priest in 14th century Germany reportedly asked his parishioners whether they'd ever giggled during union. That's not spiritual counsel. That's a one-man inquisition with a very awkward script. And if you think married couples were spared, think again. In many places, spouses were expected to confess together. Imagine you and your beloved side by side confirming to Father Ulrich that you were perhaps a bit too passionate after the St. Bridget's feast. Marital trust, medieval edition. This wasn't about redemption. It was about control. The church wasn't content with governing the soul. It wanted access to the bedroom schedule, the tone of your voice, and the duration of your embrace. Your private moments were never fully private, not when the confessional was listening. Still, people went. They knelt on worn wooden floors, fidgeted, flushed, and murmured their secrets. They confessed not just out of fear of damnation, but because, well, that's what you did. You told the truth or something close to it. You hoped it would make you lighter. And if the sin was particularly spicy, there was a solution: penance. Or fines. Or both. Because sometimes morality had a price tag, and that leads us to what happened when passion met punishment. Let's say your timing was off. You forgot it was Lent, or St. Agatha's feast day, or one of the 183 other days when affection was frowned upon. You weren't trying to cause a scandal, you were just trying to stay warm. But alas, your timing was sinful, and someone noticed, because someone was always watching. In small medieval villages, privacy was a myth. Walls were thin, beds were shared, and gossip moved faster than horses. It wasn't just the priest who knew your habits. It was the baker, the miller, the widow, with ears like a hawk, and that one cow that always looked judgmental. And when word got out, well, then came the consequences. The church had a system. If you were caught being overly affectionate during a forbidden time, you might be summoned for public confession. This meant standing in front of your neighbors, head bowed, while a priest explained in tasteful euphemisms exactly what you did and why it was wrong. It was like medieval stand-up comedy, except no one was laughing. Especially not you. In some cases, you could be fined. These weren't small penalties. Depending on the region, the offense, and the mood of the local clergy, the punishment could range from a few coins to the kind of sum that made your pig nervous. And yes, pigs were sometimes accepted as payment. Worse still was the social cost. Villages were tight-knit, suspicious, and absolutely terrible at minding their own business. A couple caught in the act, whether real or rumored, could become the subject of relentless whispers, dirty glances, and sudden silence when they walked into the tavern. Reputation was everything. One mistake could follow you for years. And if a child was conceived during one of these prohibited moments, people talked. They believed timing affected the child's health, morality, even their soul. A baby born from out-of-season passion might be considered weaker, more cursed, or worse, prone to dancing. No one wanted that. But enforcement was uneven. Nobles had chaplains who could adjust the record. Peasants had fewer protections, but also fewer paper trails. If you were clever or quiet, you might avoid the fine entirely. Still, the message was clear: timing mattered. And the wrong moment could cost you in more ways than one. But even if you got the day right and no one saw you, what about marriage itself? Surely that was a sanctuary. Well, not exactly. By now, you might think you've earned some peace. You followed the rules. You kept your affections quiet and your neighbors quieter. You even made it to the altar. But don't be fooled, getting married in the Middle Ages wasn't the romantic finale. It was just page one of a long prearranged contract, one in which you weren't the author. You were the signature at the bottom. Marriage back then wasn't built on love. It was built on land, or goats, or family grudges that needed dissolving. Your wedding was a chess move, not a dance of hearts. If it united two estates, secured a treaty, or produced a dowry large enough to impress your in-laws, it was a success. Whether or not you liked your spouse was a footnote. These unions were often arranged years in advance. Fathers bargained, mothers calculated. You, meanwhile, were a name in a ledger, and maybe a token promise sealed with a dried fig and a murky goblet of wine. When the day came, you weren't making a choice. You were fulfilling a deal made while you still had milk teeth. And the ceremony, it didn't always come with garlands and bells. Sometimes it was as simple as two people saying, "I take you," before a handful of half-interested witnesses and a local priest. If the pig stopped squealing long enough for them to hear you, that was a bonus. Romance could grow, but it didn't have to. Couples learned to coexist, like neighbors sharing a fence. Over time, habits bred tenderness, or at least tolerance. But true affection, that was rare. And when it did bloom, it had to dodge the disapproval of families, churches, and even the local livestock, who were probably present for the whole thing. For women, marriage was particularly unforgiving. A bride brought a dowry, yes, but also responsibilities, obedience, fertility, discretion. A wife was expected to stay silent, stay productive, and above all, stay out of trouble. No gossip, no sass, and definitely no dancing in the courtyard when your in-laws were watching. And if she couldn't produce children, well, people talked. Maybe she was cursed. Maybe she was sinful. Maybe she just didn't try hard enough, as if effort could change biology. Still, within these constraints, some couples found something real: shared labor, shared silence, shared survival. It wasn't romantic by modern standards, but it was its own kind of devotion. That said, you were never truly alone, not in the bedroom, not in the field, and certainly not in your choices. Because in the medieval world, love didn't just belong to the couple. It belonged to the community. In communities, they loved to talk. You'd think that once the marriage was done and the ink had dried, if there had been any ink, you'd be free to live your life. But in a medieval village, your life wasn't just yours. It belonged to the community. And the community, oh, it watched everything. Nothing in a medieval village stayed secret for long. The walls were thin, the windows wide open, and the yard shared by chickens' gossip and the occasional barefoot child who seemed to appear every time you sneezed. Privacy wasn't a right. It was a rumor. Your neighbors weren't just neighbors. They were the local chapter of the morality committee. Old women who just happened to be walking by. Men at the well who discussed sins louder than they discussed grain prices. Children, oh, the children who repeated everything they heard, often louder, often wrong, and always in front of a priest. And priests, they weren't just spiritual guides. They were your community's designated record keepers, rule enforcers, and part-time scandal archivists. A confession whispered on Monday might subtly appear in Sunday's sermon, disguised, of course, as general spiritual advice. But everyone knew who it was about, including you. Even your home wasn't safe. Families lived in close quarters, often in one room, sometimes with relative servants or farm animals nearby. Intimacy had an audience, and that audience had opinions. If you quarreled with your spouse, the neighbor 2 huts down would hear it. If you reconciled passionately, the same neighbor would clutch her rosary and whisper your names into the next prayer circle. Every sound, every silence, every creak in the floorboards became data for the social network known as everyone with ears. It wasn't always malicious. Some people genuinely believed they were protecting souls. Others just needed something to talk about between harvests. But the result was the same, a web of eyes, ears, and assumptions that made every personal moment a potential headline. And woe unto you if your habits deviated even slightly from the norm. Stay up too late suspicious. Too affectionate in public scandalous. Seen smiling 2 days in a row clearly possessed. To survive, you had to master the art of appearing virtuous even if you weren't. Keep your voice low, your eyes down, and your passions hidden behind closed doors if you had a door at all. Because in this world, your reputation was more fragile than bread baked without yeast. But even in this surveillance state, some secrets still managed to survive, particularly the kind you tried desperately to avoid, like pregnancy. The first sign didn't come from a priest or a doctor, it came from the fishmonger's wife. She tilted her head, squinted slightly, and announced that your scent had changed. Not in a poetic way. More in a you smell like someone who's hiding something kind of way. Welcome to pregnancy in the Middle Ages. There were no pregnancy tests, no ultrasounds, no private clinics with soft music and pastel lighting. Just your body, your neighbors, and a very judgmental community ready to interpret every puff of air you exhaled. Women were watched closely. Gained a little weight, craved onions, touched your belly absent-mindedly. Someone was already whispering, and by sunset the village baker would be congratulating your mother-in-law on the blessing in your house. Whether you knew it or not, they believed the body revealed everything. Skin tone, smell, temperature. Some claimed they could tell from a woman's voice the shape of her urine stream or the way she bent to pick up a goose. If that sounds absurd, well, it is. But it was also considered reliable, and once the rumors started, they were hard to stop. You'd be offered strange soups, herbs, and unsolicited advice from women who'd given birth in fields' kitchens and once during a goat chase. Everyone had a story. Everyone knew what worked. None of it was tested, but all of it was offered with confidence. The pressure was enormous. Pregnancy was both a triumph and a test. For married women, it was expected. For unmarried women, it could destroy their lives. An unwed mother was a scandal, a sin, and sometimes, depending on the village, a threat to the moral order itself. If you were lucky, you'd be whisked away to an aunt's cottage for rest. If not, you faced public penance gossip and the kind of shame that clung to your family name like mildew on damp wood. Even within marriage, pregnancy wasn't private. Everyone had an opinion on how you should walk, sleep, breathe, or pray. And if something went wrong, miscarriage, stillbirth, illness, it was rarely seen as fate. It was sin, or punishment, or witchcraft. Some believed the baby's health reflected the morality of the parents. If a child was born with a mark or deformity, the whispers began. Had the mother sinned, had the father cursed, God had someone somewhere enjoyed themselves a little too much on the feast of St. Jerome, you learned to smile, to nod, to carry your belly like a sacred burden, but never ever complain, because even the act of growing life could be twisted into evidence of moral failure. And once the baby was born well, that's when things really got complicated. The pain begins in the early hours, slow and creeping. You shift on your straw mattress, trying not to wake the house. But everyone knows. The midwife was summoned before dawn. The neighbors have stopped pretending not to listen. Even the chickens seem unusually silent. This is it. Childbirth in the Middle Ages wasn't a moment of glowing joy. It was a doorway, one that led to two very different destinations. On one side, life. On the other, a grave sometimes shallow, sometimes shared. For women, it was the most dangerous thing they would ever do. There were no antiseptics, no gloves, no emergency rooms, just hands prayers and whatever herbs the midwife happened to grab that morning. And while some births were smooth, many were not. You might deliver in a cottage on a bench or standing with your back to a wall. You might bite a leather strap or clutch a cross or scream into a pile of linens. The pain was immense, relentless, and without reprieve. There were no painkillers unless you count willow bark and denial. And hovering in the room was always one quiet guest, death. Sometimes he took the mother, sometimes the child, sometimes both. And no one called it unfair. It was simply how things were. If you survived, you were congratulated not just for giving life, but for escaping death. And if you didn't, well, the village already had a grave dug just in case. Midwives did their best. Many were skilled, experienced, and deeply respected. But they worked with what they had: cloth herbs, whispered prayers, and instinct. Some were seen as healers, others as witches. Sometimes both. They stood on the threshold between worlds, their hands soaked in blood and hope. The church offered little comfort. Women were expected to confess before birth, just in case they died without absolution. Baptism had to happen immediately if the child survived. And if the child didn't, it was complicated. Theological rules barred unbaptized infants from burial in consecrated ground, which meant mourning wasn't just grief, it was negotiation. And through it all, you were expected to be brave, silent if possible, grateful even in agony, because pain was part of the divine plan and screaming too loudly might disturb the theology. But if the child came crying, breathing whole, the room would exhale as one. Candles flickered, neighbors wept, and for a moment the world felt less cruel. Of course, surviving childbirth was just the beginning. Now came the next question: would the baby survive you? The baby is born. You hold them close, still damp, still blinking at a world that doesn't care if they survive it. But you do. And so begins the longest, quietest battle of your life, keeping them alive. Child rearing in the Middle Ages was not a warm blur of lullabies and quilts. It was a daily wager with dirt, disease, and the whim of fate. Half of all children didn't live past age 5. A quarter didn't make it to their first birthday. And yet, every day parents tried again. You start with food if you have enough. You breastfeed unless you're too weak, too sick, or too dead. In that case, another woman might step in a wet nurse, a cousin, sometimes a stranger. Animal milk was risky. Thin gruel was worse. And no one trusted the village goats since it bit the blacksmith's wife. The infant sleeps beside you, or on you, or in a small box lined with cloth scraps. There's no nursery, no white noise machine. Just your heartbeat, a shared blanket, and the occasional sneeze from the dog at your feet. You worry constantly. About fever. About cold. About the strange rattling in their chest or the yellowing of their skin. You worry even when they seem fine, because fine is often what came right before not fine. Doctors were rare. Remedies came from neighbors' grandmothers or the midwife's ever-growing pouch of dried things. Honey for cough. Ash for rash. A slice of onion tied to the foot to draw out the sickness. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. But trying meant you were still fighting. And as they grew, so did the dangers. Crawling children found sharp tools. Walking ones wandered into pigs or ponds. Teething babies chewed wood bone or worse. You couldn't watch them every second you had turnips to plant and wheat to thresh. So you did what every parent did, hoped, prayed, and listened for the cry. Naming your baby too early was considered bad luck. So many died in their first months that some parents waited weeks to settle on a name. Imagine calling your child little one for half a season just in case they didn't make it to spring. But if they did, if they laughed, ate, staggered forward on wobbly legs, then it felt like a miracle. Because it was. Yet even miracles in this world weren't guaranteed long lives. The next challenge, keeping your child alive through their first fever. It begins with a fever, just a little warmth at first. You touch the child's forehead and tell yourself it's nothing. Maybe it's the weather. Maybe they're teething. Maybe you're imagining it. But by nightfall, the warmth has become heat. The baby won't eat. Their eyes don't track yours. And in the morning, the crying stops. Not because they're better, but because they no longer have the strength. This is the moment every parent in the Middle Ages feared because they'd seen it before. Many times. Death was not a distant, tragic anomaly. It was a regular visitor. A name spoken quietly without shock, but with an ache that sat deep in the chest. Entire families had buried children. Some mothers had lost 3, 4, 5. The grief never lessened, but the surprise did. You do what others did. You call the midwife. You wash the small body with trembling hands. You wrap it in the softest cloth you own, even if that cloth once lined a feed sack. You light a candle. Not for hope, there's no hope left, but for presence. For light against the weight of what's just happened. There's no long funeral procession. No marble marker. Maybe a wooden cross, maybe a pile of stones. If the child was baptized, they could be buried in the churchyard. If not, the options were more uncertain behind a hedge in a field under a tree. The family never visited again. People offer words, but they're few. God's will. You'll have others. At least they're with the angels. None of it touches the quiet, cratered space in your home where a small breath used to live. And then comes the silence. A silence not from reverence, but from repetition. People don't talk too much about child death, not because it isn't painful, but because it's so common. It becomes a part of life, like rain or taxes. Something to endure, not examine. But in the silence, something else grows. A resolve. A fierceness. The next time, if there is one, you'll try harder. Watch closer. Pray louder. Boil the water. Burn the herbs. Bargain with the saints. Because as impossible as it seems, now most parents did try again. Not because they were careless, but because hope, even buried beneath grief, has a stubborn root. And when that root breaks the surface again, that's how life clawed its way forward. But first, before all of that comes morning. At some point, maybe while washing a cloth in the river, or watching a neighbor bury their third child, it hits you, none of this was about desire. Not really. Not the acts, not the rules, not the shame. It was all about survival, and the bargain you never asked to sign. Sex in the medieval world wasn't private. It wasn't pleasure. It was risk. A moment that could lead to a life or a death. A blessing or a punishment. You didn't pursue it freely. You navigated it like a storm, watching for signs, avoiding certain dates, praying the wind blew kindly. You weren't alone in this. Every woman in your village bore the same burden. Every man the same unease. Beneath the gossip, the judgment, and the rituals was a quiet, trembling fear that something would go wrong. That a night of closeness could lead to a month of sickness. That love, real fragile love, could end at the hands of fever, famine, or fate. The church tried to make sense of it with doctrine. The midwife tried with herbs. The village with whispers. But you just kept living. Because there was no choice. You smiled when they told you to. Cried when no one was looking. Fell asleep beside your partner, knowing the night might bring both intimacy and consequence. And when the morning came, you got up anyway, because someone had to plant the barley. Because life had to go on, even in a world where joy was rationed, and pain came free. And slowly, without realizing it, you grew tougher. Not harder, but stronger. Wiser. More watchful. You began to understand the seasons not just in weather, but in people. When hope bloomed. When silence meant morning. When a glance across a courtyard held more tenderness than a poem. You learned to measure love in hands, held too tightly in prayers, muttered into soup pots in the way someone shifted the blanket closer in the middle of the night. Not grand declarations, just presence. Quiet, persistent presence. And so you continued. One harvest, one winter, one breath at a time. Because in the end, the people of your village didn't survive by strength or purity or even faith. They survived by enduring. And if you followed this far, you've already begun to see how much that mattered. Now, as the candlelight fades and the night begins to settle, let's pause. Let's remember what it meant truly to live and love under those cold, narrow roofs. And now, as the fire fades low and the last whisper of wind curls against the door, we leave behind the narrow world of thatched roofs, aching backs, and quiet endurance. You've walked alongside them, those medieval souls who lived not in grand castles or shining cities, but in fields and kitchens where joy was scarce and grief familiar. You've seen how deeply life intertwined with fear, how love fought to bloom beneath layers of dirt, ritual, and cold stone walls. And yet they endured. They loved anyway, in whispers, in stolen glances, in the warmth of a hand reaching across rough wool in the dark. Their world was harsh, but not heartless. And perhaps there's something in that, a lesson not shouted but murmured. That even in the smallest lives beneath the heaviest weight, there is a kind of beauty. A stubborn kind. The kind that clings to life, not because it is easy, but because it matters. So tonight, as you lay your own head down on something softer than straw, under a roof that doesn't leak, take a breath. Let it fill your lungs slowly. Let it remind you that you are here, that you've made it this far, and that's no small thing. Rest easy now. The candles have burned low, and the village sleeps.